Gamer here, and today I'm starting my new series, which has been in the works for a little bit on my channel. I've been thinking it through for a little while. It's going to be my How to Play Flames of War series. This is for the less experienced players and the, like myself, who are picking up the rules now. And I thought it's all well and good coming from someone who knows the rules, but it's also a nice perspective to see it from someone who doesn't know the rules as well and is picking them up with you. And you know, I've just learnt these rules, so they're fresh in my mind, and I want to let you guys know the rules as well, and you can learn them fully fleshed out with me. Today we're going to be starting with some simple stuff. Really, it's going to be movement with vehicles, predominantly tracked vehicles. I will be talking about half tracks and wheeled vehicles as well in terms of their stats, but due to the fact that I don't really have many, I will be talking about showing you predominantly what happens with tracked vehicles, although stuff like jeeps, motorcycles, half tracks, wagons, all those sort of things will be discussed as well, don't worry about that. So, well, let's get started, shall we? First we'll start off with basic movements on standard terrain. So you've got no rough terrain, no walls, no hedges, no anything in the way. This is basically your standard move. So for tracked vehicles, you have different types of movement. Standard tanks are obviously faster than heavy tanks. So as you can see on the right hand side there, if I push it a bit further in, we have a Tiger tank there. Now a Tiger tank is classed as a slow tank or a heavy tank, so that means it only gets a range of 8 inches. So if you measure from the front of the tank to the front of where the tank is going to be, so you push it straight forward there, the whole 8 inches. And the Tiger only gets the 8 inches because obviously being a slow tank, that's what it gets. Standard tanks, which are the rest, the Shermans and the Stug assault guns, all are classed as standard moving tanks. So they get a full movement of 12 inches. So what we do is the same, we push it to the front and we go straight ahead as well. So obviously you can see quite a bit further than the Tiger itself gets. So obviously if we move those back and put them side by side, you can obviously see with the Tiger's movement of 8, shuffle these out of the way, and the Stug's move of 12, although it's only 4 inches, if you look, it makes quite a bit of a difference, meaning that standard tanks, although they have less hitting power in some cases, definitely have that manoeuvrability that the heavier tanks don't have. So your heavy tanks will be stuff like King Tigers, Tigers, all these really big bulky tanks. Especially, you know, you'll find them very heavily in the German army. There's a lot of heavy tanks in there. Obviously, if we take these back, we'll put the Tiger there and the Stug there. The Shermans on this side are also standard tanks, so they get their movement of 12 inches as well. So in terms of moving across normal terrain, it's exceptionally easy. It's literally that. You look at your stats line. You have standard tanks, which are your Shermans and your Stugs. They have 12-inch movements. You get lighter tanks, stuff like Stuarts, you know, all your little reconnaissance tanks. So your Stuarts, your Staghounds, your Greyhounds, all get to move 16 inches. You get slow tanks like your Tigers, which only move 8 inches, and you get very slow tanks, which are your very early war tanks, like the recycled World War I tanks you can get at the beginning of the war, and the very early stages of the tanks that we see in this game get a movement of 6 because they drive at the speed that people walk. So in terms of that, it's very, very simple. All you need is a stat line and a tape measure to figure that one out. So that one's nice and easy. However, we go into a few different things, which comes into our next bit, which is moving through rough terrain. Now, this is when it predominantly occurs. This is only with tanks. Infantry are not affected by this, but obviously we'll cover infantry in another video. Obviously, as you can see, we have a little forest on the side here. Now, if we can see how far I can get this tank back, we can see that this tank is now 8 inches away from there, and these two tanks are only 4 inches away. So the way the rough terrain works is this tank over here, being only 8 inches, if I declare he wants to move into the rough terrain, he can only move 8 inches. He cannot go into the terrain if he has moved 8 inches, because when you're moving through rough terrain, your movement is slowed. So normal tanks are only able to move 8 inches. So if you have moved over 8 inches before you get to the rough terrain, you are unable to move into it. However, as we saw before, this tank was 8 inches. These two tanks here are only 4 inches, so they're going to be able to move in. They only get a move of 8 inches as well, due to going through the rough terrain and it's slowing them down. But what we do is, as strange as it sounds, you move your tanks half of that 8 inches first, so that they're in 4 inches. You get 2 dice here, and we're going to have to roll them separately for this. But you say 1 dice. This dice will be going for the 75, the Sherman. So anything on this roll now, we need anything bar a 1. If you roll a 1, the tank becomes bogged down and is unable to move. Let's see. He rolled a 2, so that Sherman is fine and gets the rest of his move. Now for the 75, not the 75, the Firefly. He is also fine, but if you've gotten a 1, you become bogged down and you are unable to move from that position. This means that although you can take up greater advantages being concealed and being stopped into the terrain, it becomes very good firing positions. You have to take a bit of concern whilst moving into them, because obviously if you're too far away, you get stuck on the edge. And if you roll that abysmal 1, you're stuck there for that turn. They can't move after they've been bogged down, they can't shoot after they've been bogged down. And for the German tanks, they can't stormtrooper either, so they are literally useless until you get to your next bookkeeping stage, where you can unpin and unbog and unbail tanks. So in terms of rough terrain, we want to be careful, and we want to make sure that we know what we're doing in terms of moving through. There's always that element of a risk, but if the risk is worth it, then it's there to take. It's only a 1 in 6 chance of happening, so it is slightly, less usual. It's not going to happen 100% of the time, unless you're extremely lucky, that is. But it can happen too, and when it happens, you've got to make sure that you've got a backup plan to compensate for that. The next thing we're going to talk about is wheeled and tracked vehicles, or yes, it's wheeled and tracked, not tracked, but half-tracked vehicles moving on a road. The way roads work in Flames of War is they basically, for tanks, it's normal. They get their 12-inch move down the road, they don't change. The Tiger gets 8 inches, the slow tanks get 6, light tanks get 16, it all stays the same for tanks. But in terms of jeeps, motorcycles, half-tracks, that sort of thing, you have 3 different types of categories that they fall into. But the road basically doubles their movement. Or it doesn't double it, sorry, it moves it so that it's movement and a half. So they get their full movement plus half of what their full movement would be added on. So, for instance, slow-wheeled and wagons get 12 inches. So obviously they move 8 inches plus their 4 inch, which is the half of theirs, so they get 12-inch movement. Half-tracks and wheeled vehicles get 18 inch, so they're obviously 16 inches plus their, no, they're not 16 inches, they're 12 inches plus their 6, which makes them 16 inches, and jeeps and motorcycles are 24 inches. So this makes them very, very manoeuvrable. If you can get a half-track onto a road, you're going to be covering some really big ground, or your jeeps, your motorcycles, recce units are going to be absolutely bombing it down this road, and it becomes a really good tactical advantage. If you've got a long road, you can get right down it and start revealing onto grounds, which we'll go through in another episode. But you really want to consider roads. Don't think, oh, it's out in the open, my tanks or my jeeps will never survive. They can be considered very well, and I would consider them highly if you're in a certain position where you could use it to your advantage. So basically that's it with moving from tanks. That's very straightforward. There's not much to remember with it, which is quite lucky. Obviously the main things you want to remember are roads give you movement and a half, with wheeled and half-tracked vehicles, not fully tracked, half-tracked vehicles get movement and a half on a road. And also the different, looking in your rule book for your different movements in terms of tanks: standard, light, slow and very slow tanks, all moving in different speeds. Standard at 12, light at 16, slow at 8 and very slow at 6. And what we want to remember is moving into rough terrain, although it gives you concealment and it gives you that +1 to be hit, and it gives you great firing positions, there is also that risk that when you are more than 8 inches away you cannot go into the rough terrain. But also if you're less than 8 inches, if you roll to go into the terrain and roll a 1, you will be bogged down and your tank is deemed ineffective for return. So these risks want to be judged and want to be balanced. So they're things to be cautious of, and things to be watched and made sure that you don't get taken advantage of whilst doing these risks. Right, so that's that for that one. As many that's as I just said. What we want to be doing in the next, what we're going to be doing in the next one is we're going to be covering shooting with tanks. Again, pretty straightforward. There's a few modifiers we'll be going through, and we'll be talking you through the whole I'll be talking you through the whole process of shooting with tanks and assault guns, which are the Stugzer assault guns, which we'll get into the next video. So thanks very much for watching, guys. Please excuse the lack of terrain and the slight higgledy-pigglediness of this. Obviously this is my first time, and if you guys show me enough support, I'll keep this going, I'll keep this getting better, and please do the all-important thing: subscribe to my channel, comment on these videos, tell me if there's anything I've missed out that you wanted to see in the movement for tanks, tell me if there's a particular topic or a particular area that you'd like me to cover, and please keep the comments constructive, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye for now, guys.